Let me tell you about a story. Someone I worked with on a nonprofit board. She was bright, personable, always helped move conversations along with an energetic style and a can-do attitude. I remember liking her right away and being glad that I had the opportunity to work with her side by side. When the nonprofit organization that we were working for had a crisis and needed a new building, she used her connections and charm to locate a great possibility for us. In fact, it was the one we ultimately pursued. We bought that building and began remodeling. She worked many evenings and hours to help renovate the facility so we would be ready for the big opening, literally using hammer, saw, screwdrivers to move things along. She sounds like the ideal manager, the ideal board member for a small nonprofit like this one. She did have a weakness, though, and it turned out to be a big one. When people disagreed with her and it came time for her to convince them that her ideas were the best, she would get irritated, raise her voice, and essentially demand that things go her way. I remember one time when a volunteer came to discuss how money from a fundraiser she ran should be allocated. My colleague disagreed, and when our volunteer didn't fall in line, my colleague literally got out of her chair and yelled. So far in this course, we've discussed both the positive and negative characteristics of agents that determine their use and success of influence. We've also looked at characteristics that make influence targets more or less susceptible to influence attempts. In the ADDIC model we're using in this course, it's time to consider the second T, tactics. Does the tactic used by my colleague, yelling and demanding her way, actually work? We hear stories of bosses yelling. We see it on TV, and perhaps you've even experienced it yourself. Is pressuring someone with an angry voice the best way to bring people to your way of thinking? Research has a great deal to say about this, and that research will be the focus for this lecture. In a later lecture, we'll talk about the field of rhetoric, which is the use of language to persuade. For now, we'll focus on what's been learned about general approaches to win people over. Most of the research we'll discuss today has been done in work settings, but these influence tactics can be used in your personal life as well. As a preview to the research findings we'll discuss, I can tell you what happened in the case of my colleague and her yelling episode. The person on the receiving end of the yelling did not change her mind, and she was willing to yield to the argument of that day. She left in line with what my yelling colleague would later say is the right way of thinking. But she also left a little scared and a lot frustrated. What happened next is telling. After initially complying, she later vowed to never help our organization again. So while my colleague may have made her point, it was a Pyrrhic victory. She won the battle that day, but in the process lost an important volunteer and supporter of our organization. Organizational scholars have studied a series of tactics that people use to convince others at work. According to a 2011 study by Kevin Mullaney at the University of Illinois, most of these different tactics can be put into two categories: hard and soft. Now, hard tactics threaten the autonomy of the target. They attempt to get someone to think or do something specific by metaphorically pushing them in that direction. These tactics include making reference to formal authority. Hey, I'm your boss, and my role is to set your job responsibilities. Building a coalition. I've talked to all of the colleagues here, and we all agree. Or applying pressure. Hey, you have to do this, or else. You can see these play out in parent-child relationships too, with phrases like, do it because I told you and I'm your father. Or, your mom and I agree this is what you must do. And finally, if you don't get moving right now, I'm taking away your cell phone for a week. Let me tell you a story of a hard tactic use in a work setting. Imagine Bob as a team leader trying to motivate his team to work hard to meet a project deadline. He wants to influence them to stay late and work all night to get details right. Here is one effort using a hard tactic. Team, this is it. We've got to get this project done by tomorrow. I'll be here all night, and if I'm here, you will be too. I won't hear another word about it. Let's get to work. That's the hard tactic of pressure. I've seen it used quite a few times. My colleagues yelling seems to fit that category, doesn't it? Let's contrast that with a soft tactic. Soft tactics support the autonomy of the target. They attempt to get someone to think or act in a certain way by making that alternative more appealing than others. These tactics include attempting to persuade with reason or emotion, saying nice things about the person, what we call ingratiation, or offering something in exchange. Let's listen to what a soft tactic would sound like. Imagine a different team leader, Pat, in the same situation I used before. Team, this is it. We've got to get this project done by tomorrow. Now, I know how tough overtime can be on you and your family. We all have important commitments outside this room. But if we all work together, we can win this one. Let's do it and make each other proud. Pat's effort to persuade relies on inspiration. Just listening to her, you feel a whole lot better about the idea of working late. A few studies help identify outcomes of hard and soft tactics. But let's review again some material we discussed in the very first lecture of this course. What are the possible outcomes of an influence attempt? Remember, there were three, all beginning with C. First, commitment. And that's usually the desired goal. Commitment is when someone agrees with you and becomes convinced that what you're proposing is the right way to go. Your target commits to think or act the way you intend. The second, C, is compliance. This is usually acceptable, but less than ideal. Compliance is when someone agrees for the sake of agreeing, and they'll do what's being asked, but certainly not with enthusiasm. The problem here is that you really haven't convinced the target, and once the winds blow in a different way, you may not get what you want any longer. Can you recall the third, which is really a failure of influence? It's conflict. Now, that's generally the opposite of what you hope to achieve. Rather than getting the desired thought or behavior, you get a fight. So what tactics do people generally use at work, and which tactics do you generally prefer to see used on them at work? And what tactics generally lead to commitment, compliance, and conflict? Professor Gary Uckel from the University of Albany has studied influence tactics extensively over the last 20 years. He developed a questionnaire called the Influence Behavior Questionnaire, IBQ for short. The survey is given to employees who are asked to rate how often their supervisor uses one of 9 influence tactics. Uckel's IBQ asks about both hard and soft tactics that we discussed earlier. In one particular study using the IBQ, Uckel and Professor Bruce Tracy of Cornell University asked managers to distribute surveys to their employees, their peers, and their supervisor. Everyone who received a survey rated the managers on influence attempts and the effectiveness of those efforts. Over 1,000 people filled out surveys for the 128 managers who were participating. What did the results indicate? Well, first, Uckel and Tracy found that small differences existed in the kinds of tactics people used, depending on whether they were trying to influence a subordinate, a peer, or a supervisor. Among other things, the managers in the study used rational persuasion more often with their bosses than with their subordinates, and the coalition tactic less often with their subordinates than with anyone else. These results capture the power dynamics in most work organizations. Managers don't often need to develop strong arguments or coalitions to get their employees to do the work they're supposed to do. Now, that doesn't mean that managers shouldn't. It just means that they tend to use rational persuasion less often with their subordinates than they do with peers or bosses. The second finding from the Uckel and Tracy study is that of all these 9 tactics, 2 came out consistently and positively related to the outcome of commitment. These were soft tactics of rational persuasion and inspirational appeal. Let's talk in more detail about each and bring in some additional research to help you become more effective at using them. First, let's talk about rational persuasion. Ultimately, rational persuasion is about putting forward ideas for why a particular course of action is a good one and should be the way that people behave in the future. When you tell someone to do something because you said so, you're not using rational persuasion. When you give someone 3 reasons why they should do something, that's when you're putting this tactic to good use. There's additional research indicating the usefulness of this particular tactic. A 2003 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior found that rationality, as a general tactic, has the strongest positive effect on a variety of work outcomes. In short, it is a good first go-to tactic for getting commitment from people you're trying to influence at work. Now, in my own life, I've seen this happen, and I've seen it work, both at work and at home. When trying to convince my colleagues about a curriculum change, which I've done a couple times now, I've had mixed success. In one effort, I was hurried, and I remember distinctly just wanting to get done, so I resorted to a hard tactic. I used pressure. Now, these weren't my exact words, but the gist of what I said in a meeting was, look, people, I didn't even want to do this. Can't you just approve it so we can get done? Now, let's just say that didn't go over well. And we ended up discussing the ideas involved in this particular curriculum change for what seemed like forever. Now, the next time I was involved in a change like that, I prepared. I prepared more beforehand by thinking of a list of reasons I thought the change was appropriate for our department, my colleagues, and for our students. As I presented to my peers, I noted these points. I gave the list of reasons. I also listened carefully to their concerns, acknowledging them and analyzing how they fit into what I already learned. That discussion was shorter than my previous attempt, and boy, did it go better. The curriculum was approved. Now, in the end, both of these curriculum changes were approved, so they both worked. But the more successful of the two was definitely when I sought to use the soft tactic of rational persuasion rather than the hard tactic of pressure. And it actually, in the end, took less time to use rational persuasion. Why? Well, with a little bit of investment up front, with a little bit of work, the conversation that we had was more productive. So when I shifted from hard tactic to soft, the process was smoother. Now let's look at that second influence tactic that seems to have a strong correlation with commitment: inspiration. Ultimately, inspiration is about using appeals to values, higher order principles to motivate someone to action. When you tell someone to do something to save their skin or get a pay raise, that's more about pressure or exchange. When you tell someone that together you can help make the world a better place, then you're getting inspirational. I've tried to use inspiration in my own attempts at influence. For example, a few years ago I was raising money for my kids' daycare, a local nonprofit. In an appeal to current and former parents of kids at the center, I could have talked about how it's important to raise money to keep tuition down, and boy, our teachers work hard and they need better pay. That was rational and would have been an attempt at rational persuasion, and it may have worked. Instead, I opted to try to be inspirational in the hopes of getting the parents to commit time to help fundraise as well as to open their checkbooks. I talked about how remarkable of a community the daycare was in its ability to create a challenging and loving environment for my kids. I also told a little story about how much my kids loved this place. specifically about a day when I was given a lecture by my kids. I'd left work a little early, I got there excited to see my kids, and I got the lecture. "Dad, you came too early." I wanted to stay and have more fun with my friends. So when raising money, I went on to explain how I had to. I felt obligated and excited to give back something to sustain a community that meant so much to my kids and my family. This type of appeal engages people's emotions and speaks directly to principles of fairness, for example. It's an appeal to emotion and principle, not just to reason. People follow inspirational leaders. Think about it. What about Gandhi encouraged people to follow him walking against the police with batons in India? And what was it about Martin Luther King that made people follow him and walk against water hoses in the streets of Birmingham, Alabama? In both these cases, the leaders put themselves in a position to stand for a principle. They stood up for justice and for freedom. So when they asked their followers to take risks, they asked them to serve a higher goal. They inspired people to work toward the dream of a better future, to be part of something bigger than yourself, to work toward a better future. These are powerful motivators. They help people take on risks. They encourage people to work hard, and they help accomplish great things. We'll revisit inspiration when we talk about leadership in the last lecture of this course. Now that we've talked about rational persuasion and inspiration, I'd like to discuss one of the secrets to using both tactics successfully. In their book, Real Influence, Mark Galston and John Ullman really emphasize the need to avoid hard tactics. They offer tips for using soft tactics and gaining commitment. The core of their argument is really quite simple, and that is, to gain commitment, you have to listen. You have to listen so you can learn and adjust your influence efforts to what your target is thinking and feeling. The authors interviewed over 100 high-level influencers, as they call them, and found that listening and adjusting are key. Let me walk you through an example. Suppose you're asked to lead an existing team of salespeople to get them excited about a new product that they'll have to sell. The team's already in place and you're the outsider bringing in the change, the new product. Everything you've heard in advance suggests that this is going to be a tough job. This team has a reputation for loving each other and hating outsiders like you. What can you do to convince them to come together, get on board, and really push forward this project? Well, you should begin with listening and learning. Listening could actually be tougher than it first appears because you'll bring many assumptions and biases to the situation. We all have a natural tendency to engage in selective listening to support what we already believe. So in your first few days on the team, you're likely to simply come to the conclusion that everything you heard was right, and this team hates you. But if you reach out and connect with members of the team individually, really trying to understand who they are, what they're concerned about, what they're thinking, then you will learn a great deal about the team. You might learn that hating outsiders as a reputation really comes from a history that they have of a string of 3 nasty supervisors that span through, over the years, their group. You might learn that team members really like and respect each other because they have a long history together. In short, they trust each other and they worry that an outsider, someone like you, will ruin it. Galston and Ullman suggest that to be influential, you'll have to understand your team members' perspectives and begin there. So that means beginning with an understanding of how they see the situation. In this case, how do they see you, their new supervisor? How do they see the product and the other changes going on within the company? And the effort to understand must continue with you taking their perspective about the best way forward. Only when you see things from their point of view can you begin to see how you might move them from their way of thinking to an alternative way of thinking. In the case of a team or a new product, they may see a way forward already. That's that they already work well together. They don't need much at all from you as a supervisor. In other words, what this team wants from you is support and protection from outside influence, not meddling in their day-to-day business. If this is how the situation plays out, then your job may be a whole lot easier than you thought. It's about support rather than about trying to teach them or push them to do something new. I find Goulston and Ullman's book quite compelling because it doesn't really offer a simple formula for influence. It does not tell you that you should use rational persuasion here or inspiration here. It tells you that you have to learn as much as you can about the people involved and understand how they see the world and the situation. With this information, you'll be able to understand how to set up messages, how to be persuasive, how to be inspirational in ways that are tailored directly to the target and context at hand. Okay, so we've discussed two of the most effective tactics at gaining commitment. On average, rational persuasion and inspirational appeal are your best options. And we've talked about how listening and perspective taking are magic ingredients that help make those soft tactics work. Where does this leave hard tactics? Should you avoid them altogether? There are circumstances when commitment simply isn't a feasible or necessary outcome. If you are primarily concerned with expedient short-term compliance, then hard tactics may be appropriate. But as all parents know, putting a foot down hard can result in resistance. If you're dealing with friends or employees, the power dynamic is a bit different than with kids. Kids can't choose their parents, but at work, boy, your best employees, they often can find their way to the door. So when are hard tactics and the resulting compliance reasonable approaches? In some settings, hard tactics are necessary, especially when the issue is important or time is of the essence. If you want to get a child out of the street or make sure that she rides with a helmet on, time is of the essence. And you use hard tactics precisely because you're looking out for the best interests of the child. There are equivalents in other areas of life. For example, if your company is going to lose a great deal of money because of inaction and other tactics have failed, then it may be time for some pressure. If the nonprofit where you volunteer is starting to fail its clients because someone is not doing his job correctly, then it may be time to use hard tactics like pressure or appeals to authority. Because hard tactics may be called for, rarely, but certainly at times, it's worth considering that good managers and leaders are ultimately flexible in how they use influence. Gary Uckel's most recent work supports the idea that great managers are flexible. They adapt their influence tactics to the demands of different situations that they face. Let me quote Uckel directly. Good leaders, quote, diagnose the situation and identify the types of behaviors that are appropriate. They know how to use many different behaviors skillfully. To follow Uckel's suggestions here, it's necessary to go into a situation where influence is called for with an open mind. You have to be willing to change things up in how you use influence tactics. One area of day-to-day business life where this can certainly fruitfully be applied is in the area of employee discipline. The worst part of a manager's job is telling someone that he is doing the wrong things or doing things wrong. There's some guidance in this particular task that combines soft and hard tactics in a way that is consistent with Uckel's advice to be flexible. The technique is called discipline without punishment. And the person who developed it, Dick Grote, not only wrote a book about the technique, he also implemented it in his own job. The goal of discipline without punishment is to get employees to choose better behavior and commit to it. But if they don't do so, to move that person out the door. Here's what Grote suggests. When an employee problem occurs, the manager begins with a face-to-face meeting. The manager meets with the employee in order to figure out what the discrepancy is between actual and desired performance, explain the reasons behavior needs to change, and seek agreement that the change will happen. Notice here the use of rational persuasion. If bad performance continues, the manager has a second, more in-depth meeting to provide further explanations and to reconfirm the employee's commitment to change. This continues the rational persuasion, but begins to apply some pressure, as it should be explained that the absence of change, the failure to do something different, will result in some action. As the last step in this process, much akin to a 3 strikes policy, if unsatisfactory behavior continues, the employee is given a full paid day off. A day off. Well, the goal of the paid day off is to remove hostility and help the employee sit and think, to see the manager is investing in them. Employees are asked a very specific question. Consider your future with this organization and decide if you are willing to meet our standards. This is a combination of exchange, the employee is actually getting something, and pressure. The employee is told that they should consider not coming back if they're not willing or able to change. Now, this process requires the intentional use of a few different tactics. It follows clear and deliberate steps that encourage employees to play an active role, making choices about how they're going to be at work. When done properly, it places the employee in an empowered position. Grote's book reviews positive outcomes that he and others have had using discipline without punishment in a number of companies. The ideas really are very consistent and quite useful, even working with children. In this lecture, I presented information on hard and soft tactics and provided some guidance on why soft tactics are generally preferable. I also argued that you can make soft tactics work best by listening and taking the other person's perspective. And we found that ultimately we should be flexible and willing to use a variety of tactics, such as in the case of discipline without punishment. As always, I will conclude the lecture with 2 things that you can try in order to build your skills as an ethical persuader. First, next time you find yourself wanting someone else to do something, stop to consider the reasons why you want them to do it. List them, and then throw those reasons out the window. Now, think about the reasons why they should want to do that. Those are the reasons that you should use as a basis for your efforts to persuade, using rational persuasion, inspiration, or both. The second thing you can try is to ask a trusted friend or family member for feedback. How often do they see you using hard and soft influence tactics? Do you make use of more effective tactics, rational persuasion and inspirational appeal, regularly? Ask for their advice about how you could be better at persuading. This is actually an influence tactic in and of itself. It's called consultation. Consulting with others to get information that will help you get better will help you build a better relationship with that person and also allow you to have better influence outcomes in the future. In this lecture, you've learned a bit about different influence tactics. In the next lecture, we'll build on the foundation we've laid today by talking about specific suggestions for making soft tactics as effective as possible. We'll answer the question, what additional things need to be in place for my chosen influence tactic to succeed?